All right, so this is 8.1 and 8.2. This is going to close out Chapter 8 for everybody. As an important note, your test is next class, right? Covers all of Chapter 8. And so Chapter 8, we're going to deal with the last two questions of the section first, 23 and 24. That's actually the 8.2 part of this section. The 8.2 part of this section deals with income tax, okay? It's not very hard, but it's very methodical, and there's one part of it that can be tricky. So we're gonna deal with problems 23 and 24 first. That's the 8.2 portion of this section. Then we're gonna go all the way back to problem 1 and go through the 8.1 version, or part of this section. Okay, so that part is not very difficult at all, but this 8.2 part can be tricky. All right, so what are we doing in section 8.2? In 8.2, we are calculating how much income tax we owe the government. Your income tax is dependent, or how much you pay in income tax is based on several factors. It's based on one, what year you're in, because every year the tax laws change slightly, okay? That's kind of minor, or can be major. The next thing, of course, it depends on is how much your gross income is. Your gross income is the total amount of money you make before taxes. The word gross means all before, or there's a lot of ways you can think of it, but gross is everything before anything is taken out. Okay, so we all have worked probably at some point. The money that you make, or your salary, is not what you take home, right? Because a portion of that is paid to the government and various other parts, things that you have to pay for. Taxes, health benefits, all sorts of stuff. So your gross income is an important component that you need to have. The next thing is to know your adjustments. We'll talk about that. Your deductions, we'll talk about that. And then apply any tax credits at the very end. We'll talk about that. We'll go through it one step at a time. The best way to go through 23 and 24, if you need to reinforce it, is through the Help Me Solve This. What I'm going to do is go through these problems using the Help Me Solve This and explain each step along the way in greater detail. That way you can kind of take some notes if you need to on those, and you can see the whole process of how to calculate your income tax. Okay, so this is obviously a very simplified version of it. It's not a huge, complicated tax return. There's one other thing I forgot to mention, and that is that you need to know your status. So this person is a single male with no dependents. In other words, you're going to see various situations. You're going to see a situation where you're single. You could be married but filing separately. It doesn't mean that you're going through a divorce necessarily. It just means that you file separate tax returns. You could be married filing your tax return together, one tax return for one couple. Or you can be a head of household. In other words, you're the head, you're supporting people in your household, and you're not necessarily married, but you are in charge of several people or looking after several people, particularly children, okay? Or even an aging parent, right? Okay, so these are various situations. You can see the descriptions of each of those above. And so that is going to play an important role in terms of your tax bracket, which we'll discuss in a moment as well. So there's only two problems over 8.2 in this section, but they're lengthy, and they're definitely, you're going to see one of them come up on your test. Okay, so let's go to the Help Me Solve This, and let's learn each step one by one. Okay, so here we go. We see the same information given to us in this smaller box here. Okay, the information we have, which you must take note of, is we're a single male. And when you're working on your problem, we're going to go through this slowly. You're a single male. Does the male part matter? No, it doesn't. Just because you're a male doesn't mean you're going to be taxed more or less, or female more or less, okay? The other important component is that you have no deductions. No, not deductions, no dependents, sorry. We do have deductions, no dependents. There we go. That's important to note. And my marker is going out, so give me one moment as I find a better one. And that's not it. This one's decent. Let's see how it works. Okay, so we're a single male, no dependents. What's some other information? We have our gross income, which is what? $83,000. These are all important things that you either need to note or you need to circle, highlight, underline before you get started on the problem. And then from here, the other information you need to note, I'm going to put it all off to the side, that way we can reference it. We have our deductions, okay? So we have deductions that we need to make note of. We have mortgage interest, which is $27,000. We have property taxes, which is $45.24. All thumbs, all thumbs. And then the third one is we have charitable contributions. I'll just call it charitable, which is $3,000. All right? We're going to talk about each of those in a moment as we come up to each part of it. We also have adjustments, $3,000. Here's some dollar signs just to make sure we know these are dollar values. And then we have tax credit, none, no tax credit. Okay, so these are all important pieces that you must notate. Either circle it, either circle it, star it, underline it, write it down, because you need to have it. Okay, so the very first step that you need to figure out when you're doing your tax computation, or when you're starting to try to figure out how much income tax you owe, is to figure out what's called your adjusted gross income. So your adjusted gross income, also known as your AGI, is your gross income minus any adjustments. Okay, so that is the very first thing you need to calculate when you're doing it. Now, as you can see, they already did it for you. So we know our gross income, $83,000, and then any adjustments that we have to make, there's the $3,000. Those two things produce your AGI. Now, I'm not going to write that down on the board. What I'm going to do is just simply type it in here. My note over there is so that you know what the steps to take. We're summarizing the steps so that you can do it yourself. Okay? So, our adjustable or adjusted gross income, or AGI, is $80,000. Okay? Now, the next thing, taxable income. Taxable income is the actual amount of income that you are going to be taxed. You're not necessarily going to be taxed on all $83,000 of your salary, of your gross income. You get to deduct things out of it so that you don't necessarily pay as much. The more legal adjustments, deductions you can make, the better. Right? Because if I don't have to pay tax on all $83,000 legally, then that's what I'm going to try to make sure. And that's why it's important for you to know all of your, as many tax laws and general tax laws as possible, or have a program that helps you with that, or an advisor, a person, program or person. So notice, if you don't pay attention and you don't factor in your adjustments, you're now going to pay taxes potentially on $3,000. Now, it's probably not going to happen if you have a program or a person to help you, but just saying that this is what we're doing right now is making sure that we legally pay the least amount of taxes, okay? So, taxable income, what's that? It's your AGI minus your exemptions and deductions. Exemptions and deductions. Now, let's understand what the exemptions are, okay? In order to figure out the exemptions, we go to our tax table. So if you remember here, we came there, the little I. So we go to our tax table, and the exemptions part of it, you can see at the very bottom. Now, what you need to do, even though all these exemptions are the same, okay? They're all the same. What you need to do is pay close attention. Just always pay attention that you're working in the correct column for your situation. Our situation is that we are a single person with no dependents. So are we going to go over to head of household where we have a bunch of dependents? No. We're going to come here to the first column that's single, and we're going to be working out of this column for our entire problem. This is not the last time that we're going to see this, okay? We're going to see this table again. And on your test, you're going to have this as well. Okay, it's going to be given to you. All right? So, one more time. Our taxable income is your adjusted gross income minus any exemptions and any deductions. Well, if we look here, exemptions are done per person. So, for example, how many people are we dealing with on this tax return? Since it's single, no dependents? 1. That means in our problem, we get 1 exemption. Now, let's say you were a head of household with three kids. Then you get 3 plus yourself, which is 4 exemptions. Does that make sense, guys? Okay, so pay close attention to that. Let's come back to our problem here. So, since we only get 1 exemption, how much goes there? $3,800. Does that make sense, guys? Okay, now if you had 2, you would double the $3,800 and put it in there. If you had 3 or 4 or whatever it happens to be, you would double it. Now I want to make it just an important note one more time. The exemptions are for each person on that tax return. If you have like 2 children and yourself, remember yourself. Easy to forget yourself on there. Okay? If you and your spouse are filing a tax return jointly, it's you, your spouse, and your children if you have children. Does that make sense, guys? Pay close attention to that. So easy to miss the exemptions or the main person who's maybe filing it. Okay, so with that said, we figured out the AGI, we figured out our exemptions, okay? And then our deductions, that's the next thing we have to figure out. And that's what's coming up below. Okay, so the table shows a $5,950 standard deduction. Let's go look at that. I'm coming back to the table. Remember, we are working out of the single column because that's the situation we have. Now, we took care of the exemptions, but if we go 1 row up, we see standard deduction. The standard deduction allows us to deduct $5,950 from our taxable income. Does that make sense, guys? Okay? Or from our AGI to then produce our taxable income. Now, I want to make an important note. Remember, now we come back to here. So we took care of the adjustments. Okay, my marker is dead. We took care of the adjustments, didn't we? We factored in our exemptions based on the number of people in our household. Does that make sense, guys? Okay? Now, this one, the deductions, this is important. Okay. If you're itemized, this is known as an itemized because it's by item. If your itemized deductions are greater, when you sum them and add them, then the standard deduction, you will use that. If your itemized deductions are less than the standard deduction, you will use the standard deduction in that spot. Does that make sense? Now let me give you an example. All right. Let's say you don't own a home, so therefore you don't have any mortgage interest or property taxes. Instead, the only deduction you had for this year was charitable contributions of $3,000, be it to, wildlife fund or your church or what is it, animal shelter, whatever it happens to be, breast cancer awareness. Your charitable contributions are $3,000. Would you use your itemized deduction or the standard? The standard. Does that make sense? Because remember, the goal is to legally pay the fewest amount or lowest amount of taxes. Does that make sense? By taking out the standard, you will have less money that you're taxed on. Does that make sense, guys? But in this case, the total of our deductions is way more than the standard, which is why you should use your itemized deductions. Does that make sense? Okay. When you add those up, it should be 34,524, I think, just from eyeballing it. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So as you guys can see here, they're known as itemized deductions. When we add them, we get 34,524. Okay. Now, as you can see here, what do they do? Goes right in here. Does that make sense, guys? Goes right in here. So, your exemptions are per person. Your deductions, we chose to use the itemized deductions because it's greater than the standard of 57 whatever. So that means our total taxable income is going to be your 80,000, your AGI, minus those two areas. So what did you get? Somebody get that answer? 45,476. Perfect. Oop.
No, I got 38,324.
Okay, let's double check that.
Oh. Wait, hold on.
38,000.
Hold on, no, just kidding.
So it should be 35,324, 38,324, 38.
41,676.
That sounds better. There you go. That's better. That's all right. Simple subtraction. Now let's stop for a moment to review. Okay? If you didn't pay attention, you would be paying $83,000, your salary of $83,000, and getting taxed on that. Now that's probably not, again, that's probably not going to happen because you have a programmer or a person helping you. But let's say you weren't paying attention. Instead of paying tax on only $41,000, you would pay tax on $83,000. That's crazy, right? It's a huge amount of money. So pay attention to that. So what does this mean? It means that you only owe the government tax on this amount. Does that make sense, guys? You only owe the government tax on that amount. Okay, so we've just finished step 2. We also, in step 2, took care of our deductions, right? We already factored in our gross income. We are now ready to do our tax computation. Let's talk about that. Oops. Did I just mess that up? Oh my gosh.
Probably.
Well, I think every time you do the help me solves, it changes the numbers.
Yeah, every time you close it, it changes.
I don't know why I closed it. I guess I didn't hit check answer, huh? Well, how about this? That's not ideal. Here, let's do this. We have a new set of numbers, right? So here, this is good actually. Why don't we go review what we just did, shall we? Let's go review what we did. Okay, so we're a single male, no dependents. We have a new set of information. Our gross income is $78,000 in this problem. Does that make sense, guys? Okay, so we're just literally going to go review what we just did. That was my mistake to close that out. Okay, so we know that our adjusted gross income is the gross minus the adjustments, which now is $74,000. Does that make sense, everybody? Piece of cake. Now, we're going to decide how many exemptions we get. Well, we're single, right? So let's check our chart. We're single. Our exemptions is $3,800 per person. So there it is, $3,800. Done. With me so far? Okay. Now, we got to figure out our deductions. In this case, it looks like our deductions are going to be greater than the standard deduction, right, everybody? So This is going to be 30,801. All right, good. So now, our taxable income is the adjusted gross income minus your exemptions plus your deductions. What's this one? I'm not going to get close.
Less than 10,000.
No, it should be like 43. No.
It's 39,399.
Oh, I was saying an extra zero for some reason.
Okay, there we go. So, there we go. Now, okay, let's move forward. So, just adjust your number that our taxable income is 39,399 moving forward. Does that make sense, guys? So, our numbers have changed just a little bit. Our problem was now 78,000. Okay, sorry, I totally messed that up for you guys. We have $25,000 in mortgage interest. We have $4,801 in property taxes. And then we have only $1,000 here this time in charitable contributions. And then our adjustments were how much?
3,000.
It was 3,000? 4,000. Okay. All right. There we go. 4,000. Okay, wonderful. So now, with that said, after factoring all that in for our new problem, we can now calculate our tax computation. Now, in order to calculate the tax computation, just like we said, we have to pay attention to the correct column. We are in the single column, right? So we are single. The reason why they have you check that is to make sure you are ready to do the tax computation based on the correct column. If you choose the wrong column, it's going to produce the wrong tax amount, okay? So, now, you've heard this term potentially or possibly that of tax bracket. What tax bracket do you fall into? The more money you make, the higher tax bracket you fall into. The less money you make, the lower the tax bracket. Let's explain what's going on here. So when they ask you, what tax bracket do you fall into, it's not going to ask you that, but you need to identify it. Your tax bracket is based upon your taxable income. Okay? So, our taxable income fell into what? How much was our taxable income?
39,676.
39,676. A 10% tax bracket is for anything up to 8,700 when you're single. 15% tax bracket is all the way up to 35,000 if you're single. 25% if you're up to 85,000. Are we in this tax bracket? Yes. Because our taxable income is $39,999, it falls within this. Does that make sense, everybody? That's why we would answer or identify that we're in the 25% tax bracket. Does that make sense, guys? So we are 25% tax bracket. Now, obviously in your problem, they're not going to ask you any of this. You have to know it. But as they walk through the steps, I'm trying to explain how to identify that. Does that make sense? Now, this is a very important sentence here. This is the part I talked about that was going to be tricky, okay? I think up to this point, everything is not really hard per se. It's just new terminology. But this part right here is the tricky part. Let's understand. This individual owes 10% on the first $8,700 of his taxable income. He owes 15% on his taxable income between $8,701, which is right after that, to $35,350. And then he owes 25% on the rest of it from $35,351 up to the $39,999. Let's understand this, okay? All right? I'm going to pull this tax chart out. Let's come back here and let's understand what they mean. So when they said this person owes 10% on everything up to $8,700, it means that this person only has to pay 10% on the first $8,700 of his $39,990. Was it 999? No.
It was 39,676.
676. Okay. So his taxable income was that. He only has to pay 10% on the first $8,700 of that. Does that make sense, guys? Then he pays 15% on the next approximately 17,000. We'll get the exact calculation. So if you subtract this, you'll find out how much he has to pay of this. That's 15%. Then he pays 25% from 35,351 up to this one right here, about $4,000. You're not taxed at 25% for all of that. It's better this way. Does that make sense, guys? You don't want to be taxed all of this at 25%. You're taxed in tiers, or brackets. You're taxed at 10% for the first $8,700, 15% for the amount between $8,701 and $35,350, 25% for the amount between $35,351 and your ending taxable income, not $85,000. That's your taxable income. Does that make sense, guys? Okay, so let's go take a look at this so that you can see how that's done. So I just explained that extra bit. Let's see here, okay? So remember, a moment ago I said you're taxed at 10% for the first $8,700. Does that make sense, guys? That's where you get this from. You're taxed at 15% for the amount between $35,350 and $8,700. Does that make sense, guys? Okay. Then you're taxed at 25% for, was it 676 or 399? Maybe it's 399?
Maybe.
I think it's 399, yeah?
Oops.
Okay.
Where are they putting 676?
I think that might
I don't know. That's okay. It doesn't matter. But we know that if we scrolled up, we can go find the correct amount. So that's your taxable income, the ending amount. So take a look here. Let's recap. You're taxed at 10% for the first $8,700, 15% for the amount between $35,350 and $8,700, the middle tax bracket or the 15% tax bracket, and then 25% for the rest of it. Any questions about that at all? Okay. Now, where did they get their numbers?
No wonder accountants have a high suicide rate during tax season.
If you're good at it, it's not so bad. So 0.1 times 8,700, that's that amount, right? Then 0.15 times this, that's the difference between the two. Now, what is this amount right here? Somebody tell me what 39,399 minus 35,350 is. Should be 4,049. Okay. So now, yes.
How did you get the 35,350 minus 8,700? Why is it like that?
Because remember, you're getting, this is the tricky part, this is the amount of your total income that is, because you don't want to take, remember, it's the middle part. Your first $8,700 of your $39,000 is at 10%. The next part, that's the next $26,000, is at 15%. How did we get those numbers? Right here, 35,350 minus 8,700. Does that make sense? Okay, so the thing that people don't understand is this, okay? Maybe a little picture will help you. So you have 39,399, okay? The first $8,700 is taxed at 10%. Then the next 26,000, what was it? 26,650 is taxed at 15%. How did I know that number? All you have to do is look at your bracket and find the difference between the ending of the next bracket and the ending of the one before. Does that make sense? And then the last 4,049 is taxed at 25%. If you add these up, what do you think they make? 39,399. How did I figure out that 4,049? Because I know my 39,399 falls into this bracket. It's the difference between this and the ending of the one before. And that's how I find out how much of each of my taxable income goes to each percentage. That's the hard part. Your question relates completely to the hard part of this section. Okay? So now, if you do all that multiplication, let me scroll up here. If you do, let me just erase this. If you do all of that multiplication, 0.1 times 8,700 is 870. 0.15 times that 26,650 is this. And then that. What's the total here? Somebody tell me that. Somebody figure out the total.
Wait, hold on.
5,879.75.
Okay. And there it is. So, what is this? That is your tax computation. We're almost done. So, the third step, which is what we just did, was to figure out the tax computation. This is the hard one, right? That's the hard step. But finally, to actually figure out how much income tax you need to pay, that's equal to whatever your tax computation is minus any credits. But did we have any credits in this problem?
No.
No. If you look back up here, there are no tax credits. No tax credits. And if you did have any, you would subtract them from that. Does that make sense, guys? So in other words, you need to pay $5,879.75. If over the course of that year, you paid more than that through your deductions out of your paycheck, you will get a tax credit back. Does that make sense? That's how it works. Okay? Therefore, the income tax owed is that. And that is how to do a tax problem. Very, very long, but very doable. Yes. Anybody have any questions about that? Okay. Is that video still going? I hope so. Yeah. Perfect. Okay. Let's come back to problem number 1. Now we get to the easy stuff. Okay. Super, super simple. So, back to the beginning. So, just real quick before we continue, you can practice this over and over again. Okay? I recommend that you get it right because, oh, and I forgot to check that. That tax credit got factored in. Well, didn't have to do anything because it was 0. But you just keep working those until you get comfortable working it. Okay? Because you will see it on your test. Alright? Now, here we go. Find percent notation. How do you find percent notation when you're given a fraction? Put it in your calculator. 4 divided by 5. What's that?
0.8.
0.8. Move the decimal over 2 to the right like we've been doing all this chapter. What is it? 80%. The nice thing is that all this chapter we've already learned how to convert decimals to percentages, right?
So you do the decimal 2 to the right?
2 to the right, just like you would. To convert a decimal to a percent, you move 2 to the right, percent to decimal, 2 to the left. If you're given a fraction and asked to convert it to a percent, 4 divided by 5, divide the fraction, get your decimal, then convert it. Okay? Next. What do we need to do first? Get the decimal. What's 1 divided by 5? 0.2. But then that's not the answer, is it? What's the answer? 20%. 2 to the right. Okay? Next. For yours, it might be different. 3 divided by 6 first, because you're given a fraction. 0.5. 2 to the right, because you got to convert it to a percent. 50%. Okay. Do this one. 7 over 80. What's that as a decimal?
.0875.
0.0875. Is that the answer?
No.
2 to the right should be
8.75.
8.75. Now we actually need to pay attention to what they write in parentheses, round to the nearest hundredth. Is that to the nearest hundredth already?
Yes.
Yes, it is. The 7 is in the tenths place, the 5 is in the hundredths place. It's done. Okay, good. Now, this one's easy because it's already a decimal. What's the answer?
38.
38%. You don't even have to do the division. Okay? How about this one? What's 0.3196 as a percent?
31.9.
31.96. If you're given a decimal, it's easy. The first few problems are harder because you have harder, not really crazy hard, but harder because you have to convert it first to a decimal. Okay? Now, let's go the other direction. We're given a decimal. How do we convert it back to a percent? By going 2 to the what direction? No, we've been going to the right. Oh wait, sorry. Sorry, my bad. Sorry. This is not a percent yet. Sorry about that. Not paying attention. What's the percentage of this? 414. Now, if I gave you the percent, I was jumping ahead. If I gave you the percent and asked you to go back to a decimal, we would go what? 2 to the left, sorry. And so that's how you get back to the original problem. Does that make sense? Now, no, still. 30, given decimals of percent, what's the answer to this one? Exactly. At some point here, they're going to go the other direction. Decimal as a percent. What's this one? Where's the decimal point? It's at the end, so it's actually right here. So if we wanted that as a percent, what would it be? 2 to the right would be 2800, 2800%. When are they going to? Okay, finally, there it is. Percent back to a decimal. Where is the decimal point on 43%?
After the 3.
After the 3. So if we need to convert 43% to a decimal, we go 2 to the left. Sorry about that 3 or 4 problems ago. It goes 2 to the left, so our answer is 0.43. Does that make sense, guys? Okay. All right, good. Now this one, 42.8%. What's that as a decimal? 0.428, 2 to the left. And if you can see that, if we were to convert 0.428 to a percent, we go 2 to the right and we be back to the problem we started with. It goes back and forth. Okay? 721%, 721%. Where's the decimal? After the 1. So if we need to go convert it back to a decimal, we go point where, or 7.21. Does that make sense, guys? Okay. Next. 0.75%, 0.75%. This is tricky. It's not really that hard, but it's just a little more involved. When you see a fraction percent, the first thing you need to do is convert the fraction to a decimal. What's 3/4 as a decimal? 0.75, but that's not the answer. Exactly. Because it's 0.75%, because 3/4 is just as a decimal 0.75. When we convert it to a percent, decimal to percent, is that 2 to the right or 2 to the left? Left, yeah, exactly. Good job. So you had it right the first time, 0.0075, right? So important note. Here. If we are going from a decimal to a percent, where do we go? If we have a decimal and we're needing to go to percent, 2 to the right. Everybody agree? If we're going from a percent back to a decimal, we go 2 to the left. Any kind of fractions you see, you first need to do the division before you apply this property. Does that make sense, guys? Okay? So pay close attention to that. There you go. And so, any questions about that at all? Okay, now, we go to these use the percent formula, A equals PB, where A is percent of PB to answer the following question. All right, so here's,
Divide everything by 100 times about a percent.
yes, you can do it that way. There's actually 3 ways to do it. I'm going to show you the first way, which to me is a little bit easier, using proportions. And I'll show you an alternative way as well, okay? So we're going to do this problem in 2 ways. The first way is using proportions, okay? The question is, what is 4% of 400, okay? Now, anytime you see a percent, you're going to put it as that percent over 100. You with me so far? So this 4% tells us the percent side of our equation. Does that make sense? So we don't need to see that it says out of 100. We know that all percentages are that out of 100. You with me? Okay? So X percent is X over 100. Now, whatever number comes after the word of, that is on the bottom. So, we know what we need to solve for. Our number out of 400 is equal to 4 over 100. So, this, to solve it using proportions, we take 100 times n, which is 100n. We take 400 times 4, that's 1600, and then we divide by 100. And so n is 16. What does this mean? Now this looks really complicated, but I just did what's called a cross product. That's how you'll solve a proportion. Ultimately, it's really not that bad. So let's talk real quick. When we see it, let's review. When we see a percent, we put it on the right, 4 over 100. Okay, that percentage amount over 100. Then, whatever number comes after the word of, that goes on the bottom. Out of. Something out of, right? Well, that tells us we're looking for the what. What is out of that? And so, once we have it set up, we multiply across. That's known as the cross product. 100 times n, 100n. 400 times 4, 1600. Divide both sides by 100 to solve it. N equals 16. Does that make sense, guys? Now let me show the alternative. So it says A equals PB. A is P percent of B. So using the A equals PB form, what is A? What is the percent? 0.04 of 400, the B. Does that make sense, guys? So A is 16. A lot of people like this because your what is something percent of something else. It's an easy way to solve it that way. So either way, it works. There's harder ones that come up here where proportions may be more useful, okay? All right, now let's take a look at this next one. Use the percent formula. A is P percent of B to answer the following question. 3 is 60%. Let me erase this because this isn't relevant anymore. 3 is 60% of what? Let me solve it with you using our proportions. You with me so far? Okay. 3 is 60% of what? First, the 60%, 60 over 100. You with me so far, everybody? I'm using proportions to solve this versus our A equals PB. Okay? Now, a moment ago I said whatever number is after the word of goes on the bottom. Do we have that number this time? No. So that's going to be an unknown. So what number goes on top? 3. Does that make sense, guys? Okay. So we now have it set up to solve it. This is a different problem because they don't give you the of. They give you the what. Does that make sense? All right. So 100 times 3, 300 equals n times 60, 60n. To solve it, divide both sides by 60, and n is 5. Let's go solve this using the A equals PB method. So if we look at this, what is your A this time? It's the 3. Does that make sense, guys? What the A is. The word is always means equal. That's an easy way to kind of break it up. 60%, 0.6 of multiply what? We don't know. Or you could say that's your B, whatever way you want to look at it. To solve your problem, divide both sides by 0.6. And what is B? 5 in that case, and it works out. It's the same thing. Does that make sense, guys? It doesn't matter which one you choose. There's just 2 methods to do it. Or there's really a third. But it's tied to both of these. Okay? Now, let's take a look at this next one. Okay, it says 24% of what number is 64.8? Let's solve this using proportions. 24%, where does that go? Over 100. 24 over 100. Okay? Of what number? So, what are we looking for? Numerator, denominator? Denominator. Of what? Remember we said whatever comes after, right after the word of, that goes on the bottom. Whatever comes after the word of goes on the bottom. And so that means your 64.8 goes on top. I'm not going to solve this because we have one just like it. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, if you wanted to do it this other way, the setup would be 24%. That goes for the percent part, right? P percent. What number? 24% of what number? That's your B you're looking for. Is equals the 64.8. That's your setup. Does that make sense, guys? Okay. So let's go to another one. Is it still recording?
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. This one's important. Let's do this one. Okay, it says 3 is what percent of 20? Do they give us the percent? Do they give us the percent? So tell me how to set up the right side of this proportion. N over 100, exactly. We don't know what the percent is. That's what we're solving for. Now, tell me what goes on the bottom of this problem. 20. We know 20 goes on the bottom because it's of 20. And so therefore, 3 obviously goes on top, and we can go solve it. Let's go solve it. 3 times 100 is 300. 20 times n is 20n. Divide by 20, divide by 20, n is 15. What is 15? 15%. Let's go set this one up, okay? 3 is what percent of 20? 3 is what percent of 20? And if you divide by 20 on both sides, you'll get the same thing. This will be actually 0.15, which then you'll move the decimal place over, which is 15%. Okay? Same thing. No big deal. 3 is what percent? P is always the percent of 20. Divide by 20. 3 divided by 20 in your calculator is 0.15. And so when we move the decimal 2 to the right, that's 15%. Same thing. So maybe you like proportions. Maybe you like the formula. It doesn't really matter so long as you get them correct. Okay? Are we okay with that? Do you guys want me to do another one? I'm happy to. Just let me know. Anybody want to do this one, number 18? Yep, okay, let's do that, no problem. So, it says, what percent of 2.5 is 0.6? Let's set this up using our proportions. What are we solving for? The percent. We don't know it, so how do we set it up over here? N over 100. Always the right side is your percent side, but since we don't know the percent, n over 100. Does that make sense? Now, what goes on the bottom? 2.5, because it's the number that comes exactly right after the of. So what goes on top, of course? 0.6, yeah. That's fine. Okay? Yours might be 0.2.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. It doesn't matter. So now we have it ready to go use the cross product. Does that make sense, everybody? So now 100 times 0.6 should be 60. 2.5 times n is 2.5n. To solve it, we divide both sides by what? 2.5. And so n is what? 24%. Not 124. Does that make sense, everybody? Now, if we were to do it over here, what percent? What variable are we solving for? The p. Exactly. Now, of 2.5. Always remember the of goes on the right side. Does that make sense, everybody? The is always goes on the left side. Does that make sense, guys? The is goes on the left, the of goes on the right. Then to solve for p, we divide both sides by what? 2.5. And so p should come out as 0.24, right? Which when we move the decimal place 2 to the right would be 24%. Same thing. So that's two methods of doing it. No big deal. All right, last part, which is sales tax, percent increase, percent decrease. Now, this is all quite easy. Should be able to get it pretty quickly. Let's take a look. Suppose that the local sales tax rate is 7%, and you purchase a car for $28,300. How much tax is paid? This is easy. To figure out how much tax you pay, do what? Exactly. You multiply your purchase price by your tax rate. Exactly. Tax rate converted to a decimal. Okay? So to figure out how much tax you need to pay, you take 28,300, you multiply it by 0.07. You multiply your purchase price by your tax rate. Somebody tell me what that is?
1,981.
Thank you. 1,981. To figure out the total cost is not your tax alone, is it? It's the purchase price plus your tax. Everybody agree? So if I want to know, just like when you go to the store, it's the price of the goods plus the tax on the goods, the sum of those. What is that?
30,281.
Okay. And that's how you do that problem. Does that make sense,
So you
guys?
added 28,300 plus the 1981?
Of course, yes. Right? It's your purchase price plus your tax. It's always price of your goods plus the tax on the goods. Okay? Okay, now let's look at the discount amount. Done the same way, except you're discounting it. So if we have an original price of $9.80 and it's on sale for 13% off, we first need to figure out how much discount we're getting. How do we figure that amount?
0.13 times 9.
Exactly. It's your original price times the discount rate as a decimal. So 980 times 0.13. What is that?
127.46.
127.40?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. Now, are we going to add 127.40 to 980? You're going to subtract it because this is a discount, right? We're taking a discount on it as opposed to adding that to the price. It's not a markup. So what is the total price?
$852.60.
Okay. Now, of course, this isn't the total price, right? It's just the sale price. Technically, we would need to add taxes to it, right? But this problem doesn't ask for that. Does that make sense? So this is just the sale price. When you go to the register, they're going to go and factor in sales tax on that, right? Okay, so there's that, almost done. Now, what we need to find is the percent increase. Okay, so let's understand the situation in this problem. In 2004, there were 50,000 jobs. Okay, in 2014, there were 120,000 jobs. Looks like this data represents the number of employees in occupation from 2004 to 2014. Okay, so what we need to figure out is what percent it increased by. Percent increase is done very, very easily, okay? To figure out percent increase, you take your new amount minus your old amount and divide it by the old amount. So what's 120 minus 50? What is that? What's 120 minus 50?
70.
70. So that would be 120 minus 50, which is 70. All over what?
8%.
The 50. And then what did you get as your decimal? 1 point what? What was your decimal?
1.4.
1.4.
Hey, I was right, and I did that in my head.
Is that correct? Percent increase, is that 1.4?
No.
What do we need to do with that decimal?
To the right.
2 to the right. And that makes sense, doesn't it? We had a 140% increase. That means that it doubled and a little bit more. Does that make sense? The number of jobs in between 2004 to 2014, it looks like it doubled plus almost half. That's why it's a 140% increase. Make sense, guys? All right, so that's how you do it, and we didn't go to a decimal, so it's no big deal. Last question of the day. Find the percent decrease. Well, percent decrease is no different, okay? So you're going to take new minus the old over the old. Does that make sense? It's done the same way. So let's take a look at this. A sofa regularly sells for $450. But then the sale price is now $364.50. Find the percent decrease all over the old. Does that make sense, guys? Okay. What's the amount that it decreased by, first and foremost, so we can subtract that? What is that?
85.5.
85.5. Okay. All over 450. What's the decimal?
0.19.
0.19. Is that the answer?
No.
2 to the right. It decreased by 19%. Yes.
If it's the new, I thought the new price would be a 360.
Sorry. For percent decrease, it's original.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I shouldn't use that language there. Original minus your sales price. Thank you for pointing that out. Over the original price. Sorry. Similar concept, but using the first and second, the old and the new, but it's not really old, is it? So, sorry about that, yes. So, your original price minus your sale price over the original price. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, so that should be 19%. Is that right? Was it 19%?
Yep.
There it is. Does that make sense, everybody? And that is we did literally almost every problem out of 8.1.8.2, that one section. So your test will cover all of Chapter 8. You'll have a formula sheet. You'll get to use your calculator.
And that's
And
Wednesday?
How many questions?
I don't know. Probably at least 3 or 4 from every section. Okay? And so that'll be, yes, on Wednesday.
He hasn't decided how evil he feels like.
Yeah, exactly.